Welcome everybody to the most recent of Asset Horizon Research Commons free public panel. This is one we're calling the University of Excess. And I'm just going to give a brief lead off before we go over today's speakers. That is Stevphen Shukaitis from Minor Compositions, John Preston, the former Executive Dean of the University of Essex, and McRobbie, a cultural theorist and Professor Emerita at Goldsmith University, and Giovanni Mormont, who's a lecturer in social design at the University of Edinburgh. So I just want to begin just by thanking everyone again for coming and sort of giving a bit of a history of where this event came from. So this event originally came together from a conversation between myself and Stephen, and it wasn't simply a pun on the name University of Essex, from which he pitched a rather brilliant sort of Bataille-esque title, the University of Excess. However, this did not simply emerge from a dedication to wordplay, but because the assault on higher education is itself a catastrophe of waste, of surplus, of use. In short, it's a crisis of value. There is a notion of social worth behind every cut and closure that we're seeing. Even in departments such as Essex's Business School, where they have been repeatedly successful at securing external funding, this has not saved them from cuts, nor is this solely a problem for the humanities. So the latest announcement in the UK regarding quote unquote strategic priorities grant funding has not only dropped support for history, but also for courses such as nursing and computing. It's not a case that in the humanities we can sort of plead our case and say, our subjects are useful, we can bear exchange value, please exploit us. These universities and these economies know that they can. Ultimately, those remaining after these cuts will have to apply for double the external funding and produce double the research, or risk being replaced by one of the thousands of people qualified to replace them for lower or equal pay. These redundancies weaponize the fact that nobody is too good to go as a warning against workers and worker militancy. Your field ultimately only matters to them as a location of funds, of grant money. Education is in excess not only of the extraction of value in the reproduction of the university, but also in relation to its ultimate end product, graduate labourers. As the philosopher Billy Cashmore summarizes in her article about the closure of our own department over at Kingston, quote, "The claim uniformly is that we, as a society, cannot waste time and money on education. At least this is the case for the greatest portion of society, those in the precarious position of being rendered unemployable and thus surplus." If universities do not produce employable subjects, and the reasoning here is that even productive parts of the university can be cut because production is posited as the sole end of study. This isn't even a crisis for universities. If you have less staff and less courses, coupled with a racist, hostile border regime for students from abroad, then this will devastate the economies in those regions that depend on universities. We might even see a collapse in the economic and social reproduction of certain towns, comparable to that of the destruction of towns centered around manufacturing and mining jobs under Thatcherism. The method, in many ways, is comparable. Universities are under attack not only economically, but they're also under attack ideologically. They are seen as sites of subversiveness. Now, this does not mean that the university is an inherently subversive institution, but rather, as Fred Moten and Stefano Harney taught us, they are, or were at least, places of refuge in which resources for collective study and educational empowerment can be expropriated. But what if the university is becoming surplus to the requirements of study itself, of education? If bringing yourself as a productive labourer to the university is the price for being able to provide a kind of critical thinking or insurgent education, then Moten and Harney concludes that both critical intellectual life and university labour mutually exceed each other. I quote, "The subversive intellectual came under false pretenses, with bad documents, out of love. Her labour is as necessary as it is unwelcome. The university needs what she bears, but cannot bear what she brings." Now, what is it that we bring in terms of university context? I'm going to quote Cashmore again, because she writes that the humanities, especially philosophy, often deals with initially incomprehensible ideas and texts at almost every moment of their teaching. And so, strictly speaking, this incomprehensibility, we deal with a lot of Deleuze and Hegel and the like and Derrida, it means that their value always exceeds their use, their employability. there remains a moment in this education which is constitutively unemployable, and this affirms precisely this value. The demand for new spaces of education, for a new undercommons, a new para-academia, contains within itself, I'm going to argue, a utopian demand for a life fit for living beyond employment. Therefore, at the AHRC, we've convened this panel to study the crisis and to study what comes next for what I would like to call the defiant luxury of education. And to start off, I want to begin with Stephen. Please, Stephen, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us, about your experiences in university and what you think about the crisis for the future of study today.
Thank you, Adam. Long time listener, first time caller. I'm happy to be here. For the past 18 years, I've worked at the University of Essex, and I am the editor of the imprint Minor Compositions, which is a part of Autonomous Media. So let me get into what I wanted to talk about. I'll start with the main idea, then we'll go through a series of steps. And my main thing I want to get to is the idea that what does it mean when doing everything the neoliberal university asks you, claims to value, doesn't secure your position, and increasingly doesn't even seem to secure any more the reproduction of a university itself? So what I want to suggest is that universities, they aren't just simply becoming more neoliberal, they aren't simply becoming more hostile to critical thought, they aren't becoming more financially constrained, but all of these things are true. I would suggest that there's a certain kind of terminal end stage of university management logic that can't even deal with its own conditions and has to constantly perform cruelty in order to like say it's doing something. And that's why, as a segue, I think it's more important to talk about non-institutional spaces. So that's my core argument. So, okay, back to the beginning. I've worked at Essex for 18 years. There are 11 other people in my department with myself who are being made redundant. Now, there's always a temptation to want to go into the details and tell you our stories. And we could, but in a certain way that wouldn't be super interesting and to get lost in the procedural details, because what we're dealing with isn't unique at all. It's happening at many places in the UK, across the US. It's not unique, right? But what I want to focus on is what I'm seeing that's interesting about the shifting in these kinds of attacks and what that tells us about the present. So we're seeing things like departments closing, programs disappearing, redundancy being normalized. We're in a state of kind of a permanent crisis management. So what do we make of that? What's different? Now, what I've noticed over the past few months since I've been getting told at the end of July, by the way, you're out the door, is that I get from comrades many of these processes I would expect. Oh, this is academic neoliberalism. It's an attack on critical scholarship. Universities care only about the market. Now, all these are in part true. But I think, how would I put this? I think they also contain something of like, I guess we would call a thought terminating cliche, where it's true enough to sound good, but it sort of blocks off understanding what's different about this moment and what we have to understand about the moment. So it's not only that all those things are true, but there's something else about it. And what I'm interested about it is how what it shows is how universities are attacking the things they claim to value. They're destroying the very capacities that make them possible. So here's the paradox, and this is why I don't think it's purely neoliberal. Because if you look at the people at Essex who are being fired, we're not your typical, critical humanities scholars. We literally work at a business school. Like, this is like my like opposite of Ashok Carbon. Like we're literally management marketing scholars. Um, so we're talking about people who have designed and run programs that recruit students. So they have students who have developed international partnerships, who have been part of senior university diversity governance, who have bucket loads of publishing, lots of funding, supervised students, like done all the work of creating the things that universities claim they care about. Yet they're like, yeah, be gone. And that's the thing where which brings me to like want to rethink this moment is why is that happening? So to be clear, this is not a moment where we're seeing people who have refused the neoliberal university's demands of being productive, they're being let go. It's not people who weren't productive, who didn't produce stuff, who didn't build research cultures. It's people who did all those things and are fired anyways. So how do we make sense of you do the right things, you lose your job anyway? So this is what I think is the sort of shift we're seeing in, let's say, university management at this point. And this is where I'm going to get a bit more speculative because maybe this is where John can come in later to tell us more about how much my speculations seem accurate. Um, I think it can be rather easy to think that university management, that VCs have lots of power and agency. And there is some truth to that, but there's also some ways in which they're very constrained. I think for a lot of university managers at this point, they're less choosing what to do and more having to work to sort of service the things demanded of financial covenants, dodgy deals with sort of, shell companies who make build dorms and then they expect money back in return, loan covenants, pension things. So, what I think this shows is the way that Bifo talks about how the economy runs what we call economic, I can never say this word right, automatisms, basically sort of like stripping up agency of financial decisions. So, what I'm thinking is if you think about this kind of a techno pessimist argument, techno pessimist acceleration argument where everything is being subordinated to sort of labor becoming not so useful. I think we're kind of seeing this, but also in a way which affects university management as well. Like they know that decisions they make are not going to actually improve the situation. So it's almost like, well, if we can't do that, we'll have to perform that we're doing something. It gets to kind of part where like how do you put it? You're rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, not because that's going to make the boat not sink, but because rearranging chairs is now a key metric performance for like university management. So they can say, I've done the thing. I made a program. Some numbers went up and down. And then people can go and get a nice job somewhere else, a golden handshake, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't actually produce benefits, but it is the sort of performativity demanded of senior management in universities at this point. And so what I find really intriguing is when that sort of managerial performativity is kind of detached from actually affecting anything positively. Okay. So, and I will say, in a certain ways, this kind of doesn't make it about bad apples. It's about almost like this weird shift in the system that demands this kind of shift, the kind of behavior. Um, Now, the reason why I think this is important is if we go back to Harney and Moten, the way they suggested that you could find a kind of ambivalent refuge in the university. You could go into the university, for instance, and steal resources, steal stuff, right? There's just less stuff to steal. And if you want to find refuge, the demands of your psychological condition, your labor, your time, your effort are so much more higher demanding and quite frankly kind of oppressive than they were previously. So it's seeming to me that kind of sort of inside and against approach, which I held on to for many years, is becoming more and more difficult because of the way that before it was, again, it seemed that if you did all of the right things, you could find a little space for yourself and hope no one noticed for a while. Um, and I think that's starting to work a lot less than it used to. And that's why I want to suggest that there's something more pressing about thinking about if the ambivalent refuge of the person who stays with the university but actually leaves mentally or psychologically is no longer possible, then that means finding ways to create structures outside of universities is all the more important. Um, and I think things like Asset Horizon are one of those things. I would like to think that the work I've done with minor compositions could be a small example of that. I think there are many para-academic institutions, which we'll hear more about, which I think are doing this kind of thing already. Um, but the question is that if we're going to see people who previously were taking refuge in the university being kicked out of it, coming into out into these spaces, which I think are super valuable and important, there's a question of ongoing conditions of reproduction outside of the university and what is necessary to support the continued existence of these spaces and people's livelihoods as they want to continue researching, writing, teaching, doing all these things, but in different spaces. And that is, let's see, I'm going to say more difficult because It's a daunting proposition, as anyone who's tried to start an independent business or venture knows, and then discovers that you're sort of hustling all the time. I'm sure you know this, Adam and Craig. You probably know it all too well. Um, but that's the thing that I think we should really think about is if there's these shifts in the university system where taking refuge isn't possible as much anymore, and we're going to have to find other spaces, then how do we think about organizing those spaces in networks or not by themselves or in any ways that find ways to sort of continually reproduce themselves in a way that makes sense, that doesn't romanticize precarity, but makes the best of it can. And so this for me is why to suggest the idea of the university of excess, like we're being literally chucked out. We are literally being treated as excess. But the thing that's being chucked out is actually the thing which is actually in in theory should be the most integral to the running of the institution. So what does it tell you when institutions are chucking out the thing that actually does the thing they're supposed to do? Um, and when that is rendered excess, when it rendered redundant, how can we think about reproducing that in other forms, or at least the positive things about that labor and that activity outside of universities? Okay, I'll stop there. 10 minutes, exactly.
There's no excess in the time front. No, thank you, Stephen, so much. Next, we're going to go to John. Uh, Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm known as the former executive dean of the University of Essex, Faculty of Social Science. I'm also emeritus professor of sociology. I'm no longer employed by Essex, and I'm going to give you a bit of biography, but also within that try and spin in something about the neoliberal turn, because I've worked in education since the 1990s. I was originally a teacher in post-16, further education, sixth form sector. And for me, I think the big moment for neoliberalism, by the way, I think universities have always been in crisis and universities have always been agents of capital, right? Before that, it was state capital. So it was about imperialism. It was about, fighting wars or getting labor power for certain industrial sectors. So, to sort of paraphrase Stephen Ball, there was no golden age of universities where you can go back and say, wasn't it brilliant when universities were run by Oxford academics and were highly elitist? There's no kind of golden age, and that's definitely not my kind of background in coming to universities. So the big sort of start of this was the Further Higher Education Act of 1992. Not to get too nerdy about it, but that made FE colleges, sixth form colleges, and higher education institutions corporations. So a weird sort of corporation in the UK. No one really knew what that meant in a way, but it made, in Glenn Rakowski's terms, the people who ran them the human representatives of capital. Before, they might have been academics or teachers, etc. Now they had to represent capital. The finances had to be balanced. They had a certain autonomy. They didn't have the same kind of pressures to run things in the same way, and so that kind of unleashed universities a bit and FE colleges to do more of what they wanted, and they broke away from local education authorities all the way from the state a bit. And I first came to universities in 2000. I was working at the Institute of Education as a precarious researcher, just on precarious contracts. I'd left teaching and I went between universities until 2017 when I was got my redundancy notice from the University of East London. So there was another there's been lots of waves of redundancies affecting different universities. And it's quite interesting the way they've affected. That time it was the new universities. Now it's more kind of mid-range universities. It seems to have moved to the Russell Group as well. But these kind of waves move through. I think it was to do with the teachers' pension scheme at the time and some kind of financial mismanagement. I know that UEL at the time was opening overseas campuses for international students, and I think it got in a lot of trouble for that. So there was kind of the period of expansion, some contraction. And I got a job at Bath Spa University. I was commuting down on a Monday and coming back. So my family were in Colchester on a Thursday. It was less wages. And I was desperate to get back to Colchester. I mean, okay, academic biographies seem to be about, you know, oh, I wanted to go to the University of Essex because blah, blah, blah. I needed to live in the southeast of England. And the job came up in Colchester, but it was a management job. It was a faculty dean job. And I think people apply for those jobs for two reasons. One, they're ambitious, and two, they're desperate for various reasons, because either their careers are a bit floundering, and maybe, I don't know if mine was, or they need to be there for some reason. They need to do it for a certain reason. So I took the faculty dean job, and it was the time of expansion. So there was lots of international students, and universities were recruiting lots of international students. And to go back to Stephen's point about why universities are doing this, I think if you look at why universities are doing it in terms of accumulation and crisis. So it was a time of accumulation, it was expansion, there was surplus. So vice chancellors were willing to give people the freedom to criticize them. It was the type of vice chancellor who was expanding. They were bold in terms of building loads of campuses in the UK, expanding their kind of private property as well. But then the contraction came, and for Essex, it came because we lost, we had our CAS license suspended to recruit international students. The previous vice chancellor asked me if I'd be the executive dean, and I said, well, I will, as long as you're not willing to make redundancies. So he gave me his word he wouldn't do that. But he then left within about 4 months. So I don't know what that word meant. And then we were in a period of decline. We got a new vice chancellor, and I think the new breed of vice chancellors are the vice chancellors for that time of decline. So the accumulation's over. Now capital's in crisis. You've got the type of vice chancellor who manages decline. And you know, Stephen's talked about rearranging the deck chairs, and I'd say, yeah, there's a lot of that going on, or was going on. But really, they wanted to get people out the way who would complain about how the deck chairs were being rearranged. So I think critical for anyone who was critical of the management process was then shut down, whether they were successful or not, whether they had 4-star ref publications, whether they were bringing in income. Because the whole thing was, how do we dismantle this huge expansion? So capital's kind of in that phase of decline. I resigned from the university when redundancies were going to be announced by the vice chancellor, and stepped down from the executive dean to go back to the department and join my colleagues in UCU striking against the redundancies. But that's really neither here nor there. Or maybe it is there, because I think that the new type of manager that's required in universities was not me. So I think you can still explain it in terms of neoliberalism. You might explain it in terms of like tertiary capitalism, you know, this is the end stage, or Gore capitalism. So there's actually profit to be made in the bloodiness of these redundancies. So the vice chancellor with the most blood on their hands and in their teeth is seen as the most successful, and that's the person who's going to dismantle universities. So in terms of the future of universities, I mean, I like to go back to Marx's thing about education being a sausage factory, and to think about, I'm going to stretch the metaphor a long way here, what sort of sausage is being produced. And it was labour power. It was labour power. Now it's student fee income or research income. Academics think of themselves like they're small commodity producers, like they're artisans spinning something. They can't see the big sausage that they're making, the ref return or the student income that's coming in, you know, whereas the university management can see all of that. So the university now is just about bringing in money in the here and now. It doesn't really necessarily care whether students get jobs, and there's some kind of metric about that. So it's really just become a highly functional capitalist institution, because it's about maximizing some kind of income, and it's about kind of downsize and get rid of that anyone who stops that kind of critical thought away from it. Now, I've written a book on AI in the future of universities, and I don't really think there's a future in the university as a corporate institution in the UK, as certainly anywhere that has any kind of freedom of thought. I do think there's a future in cooperatives, in free universities, in locally run community education initiatives, and hopefully one of the, I wouldn't call it an upside, but one of the things about capitalism, it produces its own gravediggers. And I think in terms of the redundancies, there's going to be a lot of academics with a lot of knowledge who don't want to work in the system anymore or can't work in the system anymore, who will do something with that to set up something else. So I think there is a future of study, but I do not see it at all at zero in any corporate university at the moment. And we can pretend that we're finding spaces, but as Stephen said, the ship is being dismantled. Those spaces aren't existing anymore. And where those spaces do exist, these bloodthirsty Gore capitalist vice chancellors will find those spaces. If anyone speaks out against the university, they'll be made redundant. They'll be shut down and they'll be made redundant. So, I'm pessimistic about the future of the university capitalist institution. It'd be like asking me, how optimistic are you about the future of Tesla as a car manufacturer to bring about communism? And I'd say, well, it might produce some gravediggers, but I'm not that optimistic that there's going to be people hiding away in cupboards plotting some kind of insurrection. So yeah, that's my 2 cents worth on the future of universities.
No, thank you so much, John. No, I a dose of the old pessimism of the intellect is often, the splinter in the university is often the best magnifying glass. But next, we're going to go on to Angela. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi there. I hope people can hear me okay. Is the sound okay? Okay, well, it's quite challenging to intervene with two very thorough and critical responses, and I'm wondering why I don't wholly subscribe to such pessimism. That's not to say that I've got optimism, but I think that that there are several ways in which we still have to understand how neoliberalism has shaped the universities actually quite recently in the last 25 years, because prior to that, especially in the social sciences and arts humanities, we did have a lot of scope for critical work, a lot of scope for theoretical work. We had wonderful student bodies in the institutions that I worked for. We were able to produce and generate generations of critical thinkers who have gone on to play very active roles in public sector work, in many institutions. So we certainly, for sure at Goldsmiths, our students were being snapped up and were working right across the field of, from women's magazines to Channel 4. So, I feel that actually something much more precise and specific has happened in 20 years, even though there was that build-up. And as a sociologist, I think one task that we can set ourselves now is to really dissect that the parameters of how neoliberalism so thoroughly embedded itself in our institutions in a way that, as I think Adam pointed out, or Stephen, overseen by other bodies. So we were very much, there was management, of course. Where did these new management values come from? Did they come from the business schools? What kind of careers were being offered in university management training? Why was there such a close alignment of values? Why was there very little space for dissidence or for critical thinking within university management? Why did they all toe the line so thoroughly? Was it precisely, as I think Stephen pointed out, that people had really imbibed a kind of short-termism, do a job, make it look as though you filled various performances, indexes, and then move on to the next job? That could be true, But I think that we were absolutely in the faculties and as teachers, we were really faced with a multiplicity of different layers of institutions that all felt that for some reason neoliberalism could really be tried out and tested in our sector, whether it was in terms of university management, corporate values, paying vice chancellors huge salaries. And why was that not so disputed right from the start? So there were so many things going on, and were we voiceless or powerless, or was it that the people that were being recruited to be vice chancellors then found themselves all in hock to each other? But, we couldn't help but observe all around us massive overbuilding, huge overspends, upgrading campuses, so-called luxury student accommodation. What on earth is luxury student accommodation about? Spending huge amounts of money to attract students where a shabby old campus could still produce, including my own. And when I first came to Goldsmiths, we were in ramshackle buildings falling down and chairs that were falling to pieces, but we could do a very good job. And actually, Goldsmiths never went into huge overspend, but one couldn't help but observe this kind of constant upgrading of the university environment, flashy places like kind of corporate suites and like flashy hotels and immaculate sports centers. So no wonder they now move into crisis. So, that was one huge mistake, which the vice chancellors and the management, I think, are really, accountable for. And we all now have to bear the consequences. But there were other factors. So I think there was management. There was also government wanting to privatize everything, and government wanting us to be left to our sink or swim kind of mentality, that competition is good. Students are now customers. And that really, I remember that absolutely driving me mad for the last decade, the vocabularies that were being kind of spelt out suddenly changed to being like a customer services department. So, we know all that, but I think it would also be interesting and important to look at the kind of political valency of the Office for Students, because it seems as though there was a sudden power was given to the Office for Students that it hadn't had in the past. So there were a kind of multiplicity of forces that really precipitated increasing powerlessness on the part of faculty. And there must have been business school vocabularies that were encouraging not just competition, but were encouraging a kind of distancing between faculty, teachers, and management. It's as though they were all kind of being lifted up and out and into these executive suites. Now, of course, there were some exceptions, and I actually recently interviewed the Vice Chancellor, the former Vice Chancellor of Glasgow University, Sir Anton Muscatelli, for the Journal of the British Academy. And that was a very interesting conversation we had. And I won't go on in great detail about it, but, he felt that the expansion of Glasgow University had been absolutely beneficial to the economic infrastructure of the city. And, he was full of enthusiasm for this massive expansion that changed employment, increased the skill set across, a substantial sector of people and also of working class people in Scotland. So, I was interested in his rather rosy account of what, if you like, a good vice chancellor could do. But that's we're now faced with a crisis that perhaps could have been foreseen. So I'll end up talking a little bit about my own institution, and I would say that from the early 2000s, and this is a different take from Stephen's, I think that we were actually able to develop a kind of pragmatic course through the neoliberalization of the university. We could calculate that if we set up MAs that we knew would be successful and would attract 200 students, we could calculate that we could make our balance sheet, that our spreadsheets would work. We were bringing money in. We would support other departments. So in my department, if the money was flowing in, then we knew that we could support departments in modern languages where perhaps there weren't so many students. And that really went on for a long time. What we couldn't anticipate, and what I think now leads to an absolute crisis situation, which really needs a more kind of ethical government response, is that we couldn't have foreseen how Brexit would have absolutely decimated the students that we got from all over Europe, for the reason that we offered courses that weren't available elsewhere. And we produced students that then could go back to Germany, could go back to Italy, and also be very employable. So we couldn't really have anticipated the downside of Brexit, where our European students disappeared 100%. We didn't have one European student on an MA in recent years. We couldn't have anticipated the downturn of international students, but also I think geography is a key factor in many of these crises. And we couldn't have really anticipated that the taking away the decapping of numbers meant that our rivals, that again, the ethos of competition, meant that comparable universities located in more beautiful parts of London could attract and could take a huge percentage of the students who in the past would have been happy to come to New Cross. So we found ourselves in this kind of terrible competition with universities like UCL, like King's, like LSE, which could offer greener, more beautiful luxury, so-called luxury accommodation. And then the final factor that is the one that I'm most kind of taken by as really intractable is that parents now have such a huge say on where their kids go to university for undergraduate. And sadly, parents want their children to go to green, pleasant, less urban, less gritty environments. So this also has worked against those of us who all learned to love New Cross and who were able to do fantastic things in New Cross. But the demographic is that parents began to see the neighborhood as being not good enough, not comparable to the Strand and King's College. So it feels to me, and I've said this to the people that I speak with in management at Goldsmiths, that it was a kind of intractable situation. You know, we've worked incredibly hard, as Stephen said, we're all incredibly good citizens. We've done everything we can, but there is a set of circumstances that are completely beyond the control. And therefore, I think that's what calls for action which is more ethical and which would give time to the universities, like a 5-year kind of plan to try and resolve, to create collaborations, to, if need be, join forces with other universities. And this would be my stance. If I was near to being a VC, or if I was on council as I was before, I would be saying, look, we need a 5-year plan to stop redundancies, to find new ways of navigating this kind of post-Brexit, post-international student environment. And that then might also give us time to think about lifelong learning, adult education, using the university again to develop its extramural resources. And actually, when the first lot of redundancies were announced, I wrote a piece that I think was circulated that was published in Verso. And that was where I really felt that there was a lack of imagination in management. You know, you can sell off buildings. We don't need all these buildings when students work in cafes or they work in the library. So I felt that there was all kinds of things that we could do that hadn't really been envisaged. And one of them was a lot more online cheap courses. It's better to do low fee available teaching that is affordable than to shut the whole place down. Anyway, so that's my input.
No, thank you so much, Angela. And yeah, if people didn't see when I was circulating on my my Blue Sky promoting this panel, do check out the Goldsmith's Diary for Verso books. It's now in the chat, and I think it really does extend to, as Angela was saying, but the necessity of place. And yeah, it's kind of depriving people of Deptford, especially some of the new co-ops around there. I just want to shout out the Pie House in Deptford for if anyone there is listening or nearby. But next we have Giovanni. Go for it. Thank you.
Hi there, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to, but quite daunting task having to to close the panel and have to follow up on such, you know, I think, as Angela put it, thoughtful interventions, and not least given that. Unlike the other panelists, I have a relatively limited lived and theoretical understanding of some of the specific historical developments of leading to the current predicament. I've been employed in academia for about 10 years, so still quite new to the sector. Yeah, so but yeah, anyways, thanks for having me. I think it's also quite difficult to say something that hasn't already been said before about the crisis of universities, and in ways that are better than I could do myself. And I was going to say that perhaps one thing I would like to do for a start is to give a shout out to the Independent Social Research Foundation, which I assume many of us today know about, for the publication of a series of generally really helpful, I think, short reflections on the current state of higher education, especially in the UK, although I'm not completely sure if they only focus on the UK context, which is titled Dispatches Experiencing Academia's Decline. I've read a few, not all of them. Highly recommend. I don't necessarily agree with everything they said there, but I think they managed to assemble quite a good variety of perspectives from, and yeah, I just find it a helpful resource, trying to understand and wrap our head around what seems to be a process that it's hard to see a coherent end goal, as has already been alluded to by the through the other interventions. I don't have a fully formed kind of 10-minute speech of my own, but I tried when I got some of the prompts that were shared. I tried to note down some ideas and some points that it would be good to. I thought it would be good to address, and I'll be very curious to hear what others think of them. So some of these would be probably formed as some would like in a question kind of way. I guess the first point to mention is that I feel like these are generally scary times, in the sense that it does feel like we're kind of enthusiastically internalized discipline that used to kind of be used to entice academics to do their duty and to be dutiful citizens of the university doesn't do the trick. Management appears to be completely unafraid of getting quite iron-fisted and overtly authoritarian. I mean, at the University of Edinburgh, where I work, the UCU has fairly recently launched a marking and assessment boycott, and management has responded without a hint of that could suggest being afraid of being perceived as authoritarian and with 100% deductions, and in a quite cunning way in many ways. So yeah, that is, I think, is to be said. I agree with what Angela was saying, that there seems to be a number of aspects that are generally relatively new to the sector that have contributed to the predicament we find ourselves in. At the same time, and I think these two things that I'm about to say, I think I want to hold them together at once. That is true. At the same time, I do tend to agree with what John mentioned earlier, that the so-called modern university has always been a cog of capital accumulation, capital circulation, and ultimately a workplace where people are employed as workers. So it seems to me that there seems to me that management is no longer concerned about their perceived legitimacy among staff, which is a point that's been made also in broader terms about neoliberalism more generally. I think David Harvey's one that has made that point, for example, and I guess it seems to me they're not too shy about their agendas, and that the university's marketeering has become quite self-consciously hollow and quite kind of untethered from the necessity to prove some kind of social value. That's the impression I have. Kind of connected to that and to the shifts we've seen, maybe this chimes a bit with what has already been said. I get the impression, and that impression frustrates me quite a bit, that academics, myself very much included, sometimes can tend to run to the defense of things that are somewhat dubious. One thing that I have in mind, for example, is a rhetoric that really is infused with the language of meritocracy, standards, quality, all these kinds of stuff that we bemoan, and I think in some ways rightly, but then we go to the defense of these values because what we've seen is even worse than that, if that makes sense. And I think that's a bit worrying. I think that sometimes comes also with what I perceived as an own goal, which is pointing at the unfair or uneven distribution of resources across at the granular scale. I see here at the University of Edinburgh, where colleagues, in a very well-intentioned way, they say, they've gutted our resources, but look, there's other courses that have all these resources and doing all that good work because they have those resources. And I think that's just tactically quite obtuse thing to do, in the sense that it draws a target onto those who are better resourced and kind of plays into a race to the bottom. That seems to be the name of the game, cutting everywhere. there was something else that I think was mentioned again by Angela about the students' conflicting priorities and the kind of the consumer mentality, which also drives me quite up the walls. But I don't quite know what to do with it, because on the one hand, I work on a program that's called Design for Change that tries to put it briefly, that tries to understand the various ways in which design methods and sensibilities can kind of play a part in addressing complex socio-political, environmental issues. Another point that I was going to mention briefly is that, again, I think it was John that was touching on some of this, and maybe Stephen too. There's certainly at Edinburgh, there's the centralized and increasingly impersonal nature of administrative work and professional services has has gradually undermined solidarity between academics and professional services, and I think this goes hand in hand with some of the dynamics that, for example, Soren Mao has described as through the Marxist idea of mute compulsion, where we see this kind of proliferation of leadership roles and middle management positions, which creates chains of power where each link can claim to have no say over what's happening, have their hands tied, and can only trickle down diktats from above, and in the process there is no resistance all the way down. And I don't quite know what to make of it. I think in part, as Stephen was saying, that's actually what's going on. On the other hand, I find it maddening is how little willingness or sense that one can say no to certain to what is being imposed, and so that I think produces a sense of kind of entrapment by mechanics that are presented to us. Admissions in where we are is a clear example. There's a choice between admitting as many students as possible and raising programs' recruitment targets to impossible numbers, so that they comply with staff-student ratio metrics and stuff like that, or insist on quality and smaller numbers and all the rest of it, and as a result face either cuts or simply being overturned, like just being told that, okay, these are who you want to admit, and these are the others that we want you to admit, and that's it. So that's kind of some thoughts on the state of affairs. I was going to close with one thought on study more generally, if that's all right. Am I running out of time? No,
you got a couple of minutes. Go for it.
All right, thanks. So I think, and this is where I really like to follow what I find a quite convincing perspective by Harney and Moulton, when they tried to suggest a more capacious appreciation of the practice of study, which I like to understand. And there's a book that I really like as well by Eli Meyerhoff called Beyond Education, that puts in these terms as study as simply devoting sustained attention. If we see it that way, we can quickly see that study goes on everywhere all the time. And I know it might sound a bit flippant, but I do believe that that's the case, and it goes on outside, despite of the university. And I landed a more permanent job. Was it 3-4 years ago? And I've never been so incapable of studying since I landed that permanent job. if we see it in those terms as like as a more general way of collectively devoting sustained attention to whatever we decide that we need to devote attention. And so what that means is that I think that perspective is important in part to address something that Angela, I think, was talking about. All the good things that we were, maybe still are, able to do within universities. I think it's important that, at least from how I see it, that we remember that we are bringing these things into the university. That the university is not. The university claims to produce study, but we are the ones who are studying and producing study and creating these resources. And so not letting, I think it's important not to let ourselves believe that the kind of overinflating the role that university has because there's all these effects that happen to come out of the university. And maybe I'll leave it at that. I hope it was semi-coherent intervention. But yeah.
An excess and a surplus of study. Giovanni, thank you so much. Okay, we have just about 30 minutes for questions. Before I open it up to the floor, and if people want to put their hand up or have questions loaded in the chat they would prefer me to read out or prefer to just write out first, before I move to them, do any of our panelists, and of course, thank you so much for everyone for joining us tonight. Would any of our panelists like to respond to each other before we open up to the floor? Or Stephen, I saw you.
So just quickly, first I want to apologize to Angela for not being my usual optimistic self. I would usually prefer to not be so pessimistic. Unfortunately, there's something about losing your job that sort of tends to push you in that direction. And I think part of it is interesting. And to reference one thing Angela said, there's a part of Be Creative where she talks about the relationship of young female designers to their work, where work is almost thought of as your boyfriend, right? And I think in some ways the relationship that most academics have to our work is less of a functional relationship, but more a codependency that can actually be quite damaging. And that's why I think it's interesting that the initial framing of the panel was around the crisis of the university and alternative study spaces, but we ended up more staying with the crisis and less about the outside because we're so bound to the labor by that sort of weird dynamic. So when you get kicked out, it's not just sort of like I lost my job. It's like this like emotional, tragic, like life-shattering thing. And there's something interesting about that kind of psychological construct or dynamic of work that makes it difficult to think about not just as a job, but as something other than that. And I think that is actually part of the problem, honestly.
Thank you. Can I just follow that up?
Of course.
For sure. I think you're right that there has been a kind of romanticism around our labor and so on, but I don't mean to underestimate the absolutely awful scenario of losing one's job. And really that's the terrible scenario. And that's why I have been trying to kind of lobby our management at Goldsmiths to think of every other single thing they could do to avoid making people redundant. Because if you make people redundant in an area where we used to assume that you could have a job for 10 years or 15 years, or that you had some stability, you could buy a house, your kids could go to the local school, and suddenly that is upended age 45 or 50 or 55. It really is a catastrophe that many people are facing right now. And I feel it's unbelievably awful. And that's why I was so insistent to our management that they could think of any other things, even breaking employment law. I won't say how, but I did have some ideas about age and about I won't go into detail. That might, but the romance of work, you're right that we had perhaps a kind of overinvestment in work, but that also, and this is why I think the universities were not always neoliberal, and certainly in the first 2 decades of my career, or first 3 decades, I was taught by Stuart Hall, and we had a kind of sense of the value of the university, bringing people in from working class backgrounds, developing values that could be taken outside the university. And the ethos of the Open University, for example, was incredibly important. And none of us, either at Birmingham or anywhere else that I have worked, sort of aligned ourselves with the elitism of the Oxbridge system. You know, we were for the red bricks, we were for the local universities, we were for, and also along with that, and it was very successful at the time, we really did not believe in the kind of excellence of just a few top universities. There was a lot more partnerships and there were a lot more collaborations. So, for example, in the former polytechnics, Middlesex Polytechnic used to have the best art history department in the world. And people would look to Middlesex as an absolutely center of excellence. And there was a lot more collaboration across the boundaries of what we now call the new universities and the old. And what neoliberalism did was completely destroy that and turn and create a new vocabulary of excellence, or of top universities, or of Russell groups. And if you look on parents' websites now, they only refer to RG. You know, my son is heading for an RG, as if that means everywhere else is a waste of time or is second best. Or so there's a whole kind of ethos of aggressive competition and snobbery that has actually broken down the basis for partnership, for sharing, for moving across, for valuing what seem like weaker and less high status places. And I think that's really been so invidious for the whole sector. So we really need to kind of, that's why I think we need a 5-year plan.
No, yeah, thank you. And yeah, but shout out to Middlesex as well, where the original Centre for Research in Modern European Philosophy was, and eventually had to move to Kingston, and where it was sadly vandalized and murdered. And it wasn't you didn't get many Doric columns or, you know, Oxfordian reveries, but you did get some of the best Hegel education that the student loans could give you. I just want to open it up now to other folks. I see we have one question already in the chat from Debbie Winter. With Debbie, do you like me to read this out, or you could read it yourself if you prefer? I mean, if so, I can go for it.
I mean, I've asked just more musings, really. I'm quite interested in the whole concept of unaccountable risk taking, because ordinarily, and I'm a partner, by the way, so I'm a University Essex partner, so I sort of live in the cracks and live in the world of entrepreneurialism, social entrepreneurialism, and experience quite a lot of economic shocks in real time. So I have quite an interesting lens on it. But one thing that I don't have is unaccountable governance, because if I take a risk and I take a loss, I may take a loss that is so deep that it hits me personally on a personal level. And so it strikes me, I'm just quite interested in this idea that there's been this enormous risk taking, these decision making processes that have jeopardized spending, large spending, and then of course those people move on, and there's never any accountability to that risk taking, because I guess the difference is I'm not saying it doesn't happen in the entrepreneurial sector, but of course the consequences to those risks are there for that entrepreneur that perhaps don't exist within the sector. So it's almost like there's no place where I just was interested in that and how much that's been deconstructed. It's just a musing, really.
I'll take another question before we go back to the panel. I see, Charles, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. This is really, really fascinating and interesting conversation, and thank you all for everything that you said. Earlier this year, I finished my PhD, which was on the neoliberalization of higher education, the neoliberal governmentality of British higher education, and how that's affecting international relations scholars. That's kind of the home discipline, as it were. And much what everyone said is very much touched on a lot of what my my interview the people I interviewed, other UK IR academics, had to say about the landscape of IR. But one thing I kind of want to ask, touching upon, and I think there'll be a tension amongst a lot of your answers, because some of you have different views about the sort of resources that exist now in the neoliberal university. But this idea of tactics to navigate through the neoliberal era, one thing which kind of came up in the interviews I did, and I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on this, is the idea of kind of the scholarly academic acting like a guerrilla, like hiding in plain sight. So this is tactics of lying to management, kind of fudging grant applications to intentionally fund projects which wouldn't get funded otherwise because they don't show commercial value, but they show some sort of academic value, or doing interdisciplinary projects to, I think as one person said, to kind of confuse the numbers so that the people from Deloitte who are doing accounting can't really figure out where the money's going. Now, I kind of just wanted to, as a junior academic and someone who's really interested in this kind of trajectory of neoliberalism, which doesn't seem to kind of, it's going in one direction. How viable do you see those sort of camouflaging tactics, as it were, in contemporary British, but also kind of relevant beyond just Britain, for academia? Thank you.
Okay, I can't see any more questions in the chat, so in that case,
I did
going.
ask
Oh, sorry.
I did ask one other. Sorry, my other question related to.
Go for it.
It was something that Angela was optimistic about, potentially having lots of more creative ideas about extending access to education. And I was just wondering, at the moment, it all seems to be geared towards the sort of 18 to 21 experience, the entitled university magical experience, and are we in danger of missing out on a thirst for knowledge that exists in other sectors? As one of you pointed out, that the thirst for knowledge is always there, and I think that's very true. It's certainly something I noticed with the work that we deliver. The thirst for knowledge never goes, even when the economic screws turn tightly. And I wonder whether or not there is some optimism there in maybe developing. I know the government's doing the micro-credentialing and talking about hopping on and off learning and all of that kind of stuff, but if there's any creative hope on the horizon in that way.
Okay, who would like to take those questions or respond to one of them first? I can see John, you put your hand up. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'll have a go at some of those. So, first of all, in terms of Debbie's thing about risk, I know that the previous Vice Chancellor at Essex thought that by expanding it would be too big to fail. So it'd be like an Enron kind of, if it's so big, the government will bail it out if it fails. I think that was part of the strategy, and that might explain the VCs doing these mad expansion strategies and building all these buildings. I don't know if it does or not, but the question is, when it comes to the university now, what sort of corporations are they? And no one really knows what would happen for a university to fail. They haven't got the same kind of liability as, a PLC or limited company, or what is the responsibility of the directors. Although the OFS did say to universities like Essex that if the finances become so bad that the governors and the management, the executive committee or the USG, need then to act totally in the interest of the banks. So they need to act not in the interest of students anymore, but in the interest of the banks. So they need to forget about student interests or staff interests and just act in those interests. I just want to say something about the guerrilla tactics and whether they work or not. Some people put in the chat, this sounds like class war. Is this class? Yeah, it's class war. I mean, I don't want to be reductive about it, but it is. And so those guerrilla tactics, I think good guerrilla tactics might be how to fight a class war collectively, but I don't think individual guerrilla tactics work. I think academics have been in those for decades. And God, I sound really pessimistic. I'm not really that pessimistic outside of this podcast, but I seem to have inhabited that hat. But let me just talk about Debbie's last thing, which is about what about other people who want education? And I think that as academics, we tend to think there's a discourse at the moment, an anti-university discourse. I actually think there's a bit of folk wisdom in that from certain people. I think that universities and academics like myself have got a bit of blame here for forgetting about the wider population and saying this is education which is valorized within this corporate institution called the university, and other things aren't valorized. I'm not buying in here, I hope, to kind of reform discourses or anything, but I'm trying to understand a bit more where some of this stuff's coming from in working class communities. It's not all. I mean, Beverly Skeggs wrote about this in 1997, I think, in Class Self-Culture. You know, the rejection of university education because it was seen as being disrespectable. And actually respectable learning was outside of the university. And just thinking, are we always valorizing what is important to people? So I guess I'm a bit muddled by this whole by the whole system. Other than it needs collective resistance and it needs a bit of thinking outside of the bounds of the university. I know we all work or have worked in universities, but I think that stops us seeing other things because we're encultured into a certain way of thinking. You know, we might pretend we're organic intellectuals, but we might have left that world behind a long time ago by being so encultured into the university system. So yeah, they're my thoughts on those things.
Stephen, go for it. Stephen.
So two quick things on risk taking in university governance. For my sins, I was on university senate for 10 years and on council for 3 years, and one of the things I kept seeing happen again and again is this very weird sort of like kind of groupthink where there would only ever be like one proposal made of a plan, and any attempt to critique or discuss any other option was sort of instantly shut down. And I found this really strange, not in terms of a like launching a like a heroic anti-capitalist manifesto, but more that this makes bad capitalism. It was just like leading to like really inefficient, bad decision making, even staying on the own terms of what's trying to be accomplished. And I find that really strange why we have institutions that sort of like produce that kind of quite disformed decision making process, which just seems nonsensical to me. Second, in terms of sort of like David's also question about like long term, does university make sense to send 18 to 21-year-olds? I'm actually not even sure anymore. Like I have a son who's 14, and I'm not necessarily sure that like it's like the best thing to do. I mean, I almost think like it would be better to get people out in the world and doing stuff, and then find things they want to learn about after they've had to experience a bit of like, actually, there's a lot of things in the world that suck in terms of working. Here's what I really care about. I think we're probably going to see some university failures and new forms of institutional arrangements emerge. I think is it Virna who says that we're living through a new 17th century and there will be new institutional arrangements emerging in the near future? Hopefully they'll be interesting ones and not sort of like techno-fascist bro institutions, which is probably what we're going to get. But my optimism is maybe it could be slightly better than that.
Yes, Angela,
Can
please
I
go for it.
just come back to Giovanni's point about students and employability, and how if you're teaching in a design or a creative sector and the students get absolutely blown away by critical thinking and by social theory, and they really immerse themselves in it, and then they are asking the question, well, what can I do when I leave the university? And I would say at Goldsmiths, we really have put a lot of effort into thinking about this question. And it really dates back some decades where people like myself were often seen as being not Marxist enough because as a feminist, I would very much want to feel that the students that were paying fees and that were working so hard had a future in work. And I didn't want them to be absolutely despondent when they left university. So I think several of my colleagues that we would, especially around creative economy and creative industries, we would kind of tailor our input of pedagogy so that, yes, of course, students would say, oh my God, my dream is to work for Vivienne Westwood. And we didn't want to puncture that dream. At the same time, we were giving them a lot of critical sociology. So then what we were developing was a way of thinking, yes, well, if you get that job with Vivienne Westwood, you're going to be bringing a whole body of knowledge about supply chains, about the global south, about manufacture, and this will be fresh. This will, you might well find that you can make use of. We're not saying it's got to overwhelm or over-determine your career choices so that you can't possibly enter the fashion industry. We would be saying, yes, you've got talent, you've got design, you want to work for Alexander McQueen or whatever, but you've also got this strong body of sociology that will help you to understand what's going on when you're working in a design studio, and that will help you to understand the politics of labor. And that really has been a principle that I think has had some kind of impact, if you like, because now people in fashion, 10 years ago, people in fashion didn't want to know about supply chains or manufacture or labor union rights. And now that vocabulary has kind of crept into the sector. So it's not about being optimistic for the sake of it. Maybe it's being more pragmatic about the uses of sociology.
As I started my intervention, I said it's scary times, and I would assume that most on this panel will know that Edinburgh is planning around potentially, according to the UCU, up to 2,000 redundancies. So I'm trying to be watchful of kind of what I say. Let's put it that way. So I don't want to find myself, in the wrong side of a meeting, let's say. But yeah, no, I mean, my comment on that was somewhat flippant in the sense that, of course, there's all sorts of ways in which the kind of, and I'm glad that you bring up the kind of a neighboring, let's say a neighboring sector of work sector in fashion design, and indeed we have some students that come from fashion design and want to use fashion as an instrument for social change. So yeah, of course there's all sorts of ways in which we try and kind of give our students a certain tools for critically interrogating what they're doing and critically interrogating the context in which they're doing it. I guess the bit where I become a bit kind of maybe cynical and pessimistic when I talk to students that ask that question is because I think the power of design can also be overstated, in the sense that then when you find yourself in a design studio, you would be very lucky to get someone that is willing to listen and to readjust what they are doing and the business model, because you come with the critical and sociological awareness of how things should really be done. So that's where I guess as a lecturer, as a teacher, I find myself in a difficult situation when students ask that question, because I don't quite know what to say. That yes, of course I understand that you need a wage, and I also understand that some of the stuff that that maybe we're trying to teach you would like to undermine the very basics of the wage relation. So yeah, it's a difficult, I think. But I just wanted to say two brief points in relation to the questions from the audience. So it was Debbie that mentioned risk, and just to add maybe a slight counterpoint to the situation of universities that are in deficit. So the University of Edinburgh is not in deficit, and yet the language of risk is precisely what has been used to justify a series of preventive measures so that we don't get in a position of deficit. I'll spare you the whole kind of disagreement in terms of the entity of the kind of the loss and profits between management and the UCU and whatnot. But just to say that language of risk is also something that is kind of a backdoor to also say, oh no, we can't really afford to be in that position, and so we're going to do exactly the same that the universities are doing. They find themselves in that position. And just finally, on the question of guerrilla tactics, just one point that maybe is slightly tangential to that is that I see way too many colleagues that seem to be really distraught day in, day out at how their bosses don't value them, and how their work is not appreciated by management and all the rest of it. And I'm not terribly. I'm more surprised by that response than by what triggered it. And so I guess the question of guerrilla, for me, what I would hope to see is a bit more of a Hanemoto would call it a general antagonism across the staff body that kind of is a bit less invested in trying to to be given the medal for being the best lecturer and this and that and the other, and looking kind of sideways instead of upwards, and in fact downwards as well, particularly sorry, I can't remember the name. Charles, you just finished your PhD, particularly those kind of graduate students there also doing teaching and tutoring and all the rest of it. So yeah, I'll be more concerned about what graduate students and administrative services think of us than our bosses, personally.
No, thank you, everyone. We've just reached the 90-minute mark, so I just want to be respectful of everyone's time and say that to all of our panelists, John, Angela, Giovanni, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us tonight for this panel. Thank you, everyone, for the questions and the chat and for coming. Like, this has been like bloody well attended. Giovanni, if we want to take out the employability stuff, don't worry, we can do that in the recording. Guerrilla tactics rely on not being seen and definitely not being caught. Stephen, sorry.
I know we're getting to an end, but can we have like 10-minute discussion of like pair academic institutions? Because I was told I was going to hear about Angela's new thing, and I wanted to hear about it, and I haven't heard it yet. And I'm sure and maybe you could tell us a bit more about the AHRC Asset Research Commons. I mean,
no, actually, yes, of course. Angela, would you like to begin? Because I know you have to head off soon regarding your sort of new night school project, if that's okay.
Oh, well, I just floated an idea that really picks up on some aspects of what I have been referring to, which would be how can you develop a low-fee mode of delivery that is either on the edges of the university or that really is currently independent. I'm thinking, the question really is, how can we maintain the pedagogy that we've all developed and the skills and the expertise and the bodies of knowledge and critical fashion studies and so on, if there is no longer the week-to-week infrastructure for doing that. And it also, my idea also emerges out of the fact that in the UK, very few British students can afford to do a master's. You know, it's become absolutely unaffordable unless they've got private wealth or they've got a lot of parental support. So I've generally been discussing with colleagues how we could introduce something like what used to be a kind of night school model, and which could be 5-week short courses, and it doesn't need to be accredited. If you've got interesting people teaching and you've got a low cost of threshold, it can at least keep the kinds of conversations that we've developed over the years going. And I say that because the two subject areas that I work in, cultural studies and sociology, are equally adversely affected by these cuts. And at the same time, the people that established them, particularly in the UK, like Richard Hoggart and Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall, all began their careers in what used to be called extramural departments or adult education departments. So, you know, again, there's the question of, well, how can people be employed? What new teaching kind of jobs can we create that would maintain the basic, radical, advanced, theoretically informed work that so many of us have done in journals, publications? So what models are there, and what models could we invent? And going back to the idea of the kind of night school is, I would say, with online resources, actually not inconceivable, not impossible to imagine.
Can I just add in there that we run this model as a partner, so we have to be very responsive to economic twists and turns, and we offer short courses for £30, and they do, you know, we generate quite a sizable income from them, because, and that's thing I noticed, that when there is a squeeze, the sale of these courses go up. So I think there is, and what I've really observed, just I don't have any hard evidence for it, but what I've observed is that knowledge desire never goes. It never goes. But it's just the affording it that does. And I think you're right, really. I think that is, if there is a glimmer of hope, I think it possibly lays in that reinvention.
Yeah, if I could just follow on that just by talking about some of the stuff that we do here at the AHRC. Just to explain for people who don't know what the AHRC is, it is not the Arts and Humanities Research Council. That is something of a pun on my end, but the name was originally an American formulation for the Asset Horizon Research Commons. And essentially what we do here is more or less we use the platform that we've generated through the podcast to essentially crowdfund courses, essentially. So to make sure that everyone's gets paid. We've so far had 13 courses in the past year or so. We've got another, I think, 6 coming up for the autumn to January, to sort of early sort of January season, and then we're about to start programming for the next year. So essentially we deliver 4-week courses of instructors on topics from as wide as we've recently had sort of Baudrillard and Philip K. Dick. We've had Fanon and Sartre. We've had an upcoming course on anti-civilizational thought, which people who are at the Should We All Live in Communes panel would have seen the other time. We've had courses on myth, tragedy, and liberation, Nietzsche and Bataille. We've had, I did one on Immanuel Kant. We've had Laruelle, nostalgia, acid communism, something of a constant concern for us here over at the Asset Horizon Research Commons. And as Craig has just put in the chat, the upcoming ones we have commodity theory, Marx, Adorno, Rose, Winter, and Moten with Billy Cashmore. We have the aesthetics of offal, a reading group on abjection, shame, and repulsion by Sasha Ravich. We have self-organization, which is by our comrade Nick Travagolini on Lucretius Marx and Simondo, and other people such as Isabel Stengers, as well as bringing people in from the Prisons Education Project over in California. And we've also got some stuff on the theories of fascism, people like Further Light, Benjamin, Deleuze and Guattari, Japanese Marxism, and an additional course on Jung and Spinoza, and those are by Juan Diego Perez Nunez from the University of the Andes in Bogota, Fernando Wirtz and Robert Langen, respectively. So this is quite a new thing, but it's goes so far, which is proved as a viable model. We are trying to provide homes for courses that the university either wouldn't provide, or simply provide, spaces where we can conduct spaces like this, conduct panels like this, in a ways that Java University would no longer allow us to do. As Mota Nahani said, it is becoming increasingly impossible to study within the university. So this is a kind of our contribution to this model. I also want to shout out to our colleague Emma Stam as well. She's working with the Lennox Institute over in New York, and there is a wider ecology of these para-academic, extra-academic, almost like lifeboats for study today. And I think these, as Andrew said, these are going to be needed. The night school, even the university believed in the night school at one point with something like Birkbeck, as a workers' school, if people know it, in London. So I don't know if does anyone else have any para-academic projects they have going on that would like to expand, because this requires an ecology. This isn't a matter of pure economic competition. Stephen.
I mean, at the risk of getting myself instantly flooded with book proposals, one thing I'm going to have to be figuring out in the very near future is that I've kind of subvented Minor Compositions, which has put out 70 books since 2009 by my job. And so I did have to think about what is an ecology of practices outside of this institutional setting that allows for continued production of open access critical scholarship in terms of books and podcasts. But that's I haven't solved that yet, but I will hopefully try to figure it out very soon.
You could support Minor Compositions and get such books as Communization That's Discontents, The Wages of Green Work. I'm just reaching over to my bookshelf for the moment. You've got Disassembly by Joel Vraunig. Giovanni has a book out with Minor Compositions on the studious use. It is a cracking bit of kit factory, if I were to describe it in the most strident theoretical terms, and absolutely deserves all the support that one can ever give it.
I'm going to put that on a shirt now. What was it? A striking bit of kit factory?
Cracking bit of kit factory.
Excellent.
We can compete with Clapton, and if anyone sees Stephen about a Clapton, pints are needed. But anyway, I just want to say thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I will leave everyone to the remainder of their Friday evenings or Friday afternoons or even Friday mornings, depending on where you're joining us from. And again, thank you everyone for supporting this kind of research, this kind of public work. And thank you again to all of our panelists. And also thank you for listening on the recording. And we'll hope to see you around. See you next time.